Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this fourth and final session in our series about the art of lament. I'm obviously not Clover. I'm Tim Beal. She was planning on introducing our guest this morning, but she has COVID. It's been a rough week. She's slowly getting better. Pádraig, she sends her love to you and to all of you as well, and she is watching. So we in previous sessions, we looked at lament as a form in biblical tradition and also the sort of ritual contexts in which lament and complaint were performed, were enacted, were embodied. And then we had a session on lament in music, and then a session last week on lament in the visual arts. And today we are focusing in this fourth and final session on poetry and lament. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our teacher and conversation partner and a good friend of Clover's and mine, Pádraig Ó Tuama. Many of you, I'm sure, know Pádraig's work from various different contexts well. He's a poet and an essayist. He's a teacher and a convener. His work moves around themes of language and power and conflict and religion. He has a PhD in theology. He has served and will be serving soon again in various visiting faculty appointments. He's probably best known by for some of you from Poetry Unbound, which is part of Krista Tippett's On Being program and project. Pádraig, I think you've published 10 books in 10 years. The most recent are Feed the Beast, a book of poetry, and Poetry Unbound, 50 Poems to Open Your World. Those are both out very recently. He has another one coming, and I encourage you to pre-order it, called Kitchen Hymns. I've gotten a little preview of that and very excited to see that. And there's at least one more coming that I can't wait to talk more about soon. He's a busy fella, and we are lucky to have him with us. Clover and I are grateful to know him as a friend. He's as lovely as a friend as he is as a teacher and a poet and a conversation partner. So before I say please join me in welcoming Pádraig Ó Tuama, I'm going to explain that I'm going to mute me on the right there, and we're going to pin Pádraig so he's full screen, and you'll be able to see the texts that he is sharing. We have a few copies of those for after as well, if you would like to take those with you. So, one second here. Hide self view. Pin. I'm going to put, Pádraig is going to see you guys. Oops. Sorry, I just muted myself. There we go. All right.
There we are.
And
can you hear me?
Can you all hear? Okay? Okay, and he can now see you. The camera is pointed out to you. So please join me in welcoming Pádraig Ó Tuama.
It's lovely to see you all. Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Clover, for the opportunity to be with you to talk about Poetry Lamentation today. Can you hear me? I know I have a quiet voice. You can? It's okay? Oh, great. Like Tim said, I am a bit of a vagabond, so I have a few different jobs, one of which is based at Columbia University and also with working with Krista Tippett. So I am in New York a lot, so that's where I'm coming to you from today. Hell's Kitchen in New York, Lenape land. And I'm very pleased to be here and talking to you about poetry and the intelligence that poetry carries. I know that today and tomorrow and the day after and the next weeks are dreadful anniversaries about the atrocity that happened on October the 7th, and then the continuing atrocity and catastrophe about what's happened since as well. And then with everything that's moving on into Lebanon, I've been texting friends in Lebanon over the last few days trying to figure out how they are they safe, as well as increasing hostilities between Iran and Israel. I'm not going to speak about that. I wouldn't do any good if I were to, but I have to acknowledge it. Of course, we all do. What I know is that everybody's concern moves into this in different directions, but I think once we take 5 steps of concern, we find an enormous amount of shared concern with each other. Your first step of concern might go one way because of family or politics or relationships or interests, but by the time you get to 5 steps of concern, my guess is that a huge amount of people are just saying whatever will mean a just and stable future and an end to killing and an end to the fantasy of war, which is likely to turn into a further reality. So it's an appropriate day, I suppose, for us to talk about a lamentation. Lamentation is an old human technology. It's important to say, of course, that humans aren't the only animals to lament. Elephants lament, dogs lament. You see profound empathy, and you see ways within which living, breathing beings make sounds with their body, the sounds that are meant to carry a sound of feeling. No sound is perfect for the feeling, but it tries, in which case every piece of language utterance, and I mean that as much from an elephant as I mean from myself, every piece of language utterance is a metaphor, a failed metaphor, for trying to be a vehicle for carrying something of substance into the question of what it means to embody it and be it. And we're going to look at attempts through millennia to give sorrow words, which is what Shakespeare called lament, giving sorrow words. And we're going to look at examples of that. We're going to listen to one song in Irish as we begin. I'm going to put it up on the screen as well so you can follow along. Some of you, there might be some Irish speakers there. I'm guessing most of you don't speak any Irish. Gaelic, Americans call it. Gaelic is an umbrella term for 3 languages, so we tend to be a bit more specific about which Gaelic language we're talking about. So the Gaelic in Ireland tends to be called Irish when we're speaking in English. And then we're going to look at the book of Lamentations as well as then some contemporary poems, some of which were written as recently as last year, and others of which have been written, over the last century. I have loads there, and we're going to take a hop, skip, and a jump through, and then we're going to have some time for some questions, maybe in about 20 minutes. I probably won't get through everything, but you have the handout with the poems printed if you wish to look a little bit further. So the first lament we're going to look at is called Caoine na Drí Mhuire, the Lament of the Three Marys. Caoine is the Irish word for crying or lament. It's one of the few words that comes into English from Irish. You hear people keening. That might be a phrase you're familiar with, and that actually comes from the Irish word caoine. Another word that comes into English from Irish is whiskey. You might not be surprised to hear about that. But caoine, lament and whiskey are some of the words that come into English through Irish. The other one is slew for a crowd. The Irish word for a crowd is slua. So I think there's 6 or 7 words that have made their way into kind of global English through Irish language or Gaelic languages. And this is it's a persona poem really. Where some of the Marys, the 3 Marys, are gathered around the cross watching Jesus of Nazareth be tortured and die from this torture device devised by the Romans and instituted by the Romans here. And the different Marys are each singing, and Peter is singing a reply. And what you hear over and over again in this is this repeated phrase, ochon is ochon o. And the translation to English is something like alas and alas and alas, okay? But that sounds a little bit melodramatic, Nobody these days, when you're upset, says alas, Maybe somebody in Jane Austen does, or it's translated into English for this, one of the translations for this poem as alas and woe to me. But achon is achon o, Ochon, it doesn't mean anything. There's no actual etymology. It's the sound of grief. It's giving sorrow words. It's doing what we've done before we have language, which is to keen, which is to make a sound. I'll put the lyric up, and I'm actually also going to play it, and then you can hear some of it. This is a beautiful piece. It's referenced on the handout that Tim can hand you as to where you can listen to this. It's a stunning Irish singer called Irlo Linnard, and his rendition of this traditional song is beautiful. It's on an album called 7 Steps to Mercy, which is a beautiful, beautiful album. And it's referenced on the handout if you want to take a screenshot of it or grab one of the handouts that Tim has there if you're interested in listening further to this magnificent artist. So let me share my screen so you can see, and then I'll play some of this song. So here we go. Now.
Chonig mer bole a chesig nordon o chochon agus ochon ke on farbrashe
So yeah, this goes on for another 4 minutes, so I'm not going to play the whole thing, beautiful as it is. It is, his voice is, it's my absolute favourite of contemporary Irish language singers. You might recognise him if any of you like Irish music and listen to The Gloaming. He's also the singer in the band The Gloaming. So I just want to look at this. I mean, the two particular elements of this that I think are most insightful about the poetry of lament is this repeated refrain, ochon is ochon o, ochon is ochon o, ochon is ochon o. Vowel sounds in poetry often have the capacity to carry emotion. And sometimes when I'm looking at a poem that I've written and trying to figure out what the emotion of it is, or if the emotion that it's conveying is adequate, I'll read through it simply by pronouncing the vowel sounds to give a sense of what is the music that's being called out through the slender or the broad vowels in whatever language. And so there's something about having a word like that and then a repeated phrase like that that refers to the sound of sorrow, giving sorrow words. Ochon is ochon o. It's implying that language is pointing to where language doesn't know how to go, but is trying. It is a vehicle, it's a stretching forward. And that is one of the functions of lamentation. So often, you know this from your own griefs as well as civic and political and international griefs, where so often what happens is people say, I just don't know what to say. And what we have in the long repository of language is ways in which we've always known that. And what we make sure to do is to try to make some kind of sound. Some kind of sound of soothing or of lament or of rage or of wailing. All of these things come into the various traditions from which we come. And that's one of the particular features that you see in this piece of lamentation. The second one that I want to point out particularly is this stanza here. You know, no nation and machin a hill in Nachtmvaire, you know, is this little son who was reared at Mary's breast, and then there's a chon as a chon, and then but this particular line here, I find it one of the most beautiful and poignant lines of all Irish poetry. A vichin vornach tá the veilers the shronin geartha. Oh, my little darling son, your mouth and your nose are cut. I was speaking to a friend who's a scholar of Irish music and Irish traditional music, and when she was looking at this, she said, what man could have written that line? She said, this is the kind of line that comes from the mouth of a woman. And, you know, this, nobody knows who wrote this particular lament. It's hundreds of years old. So what this particular friend of mine, Noreen Yvrian, was saying is that so many of the laments that you see in the Irish tradition, I'm guessing in others too, it's only that I don't have the knowledge that I'm not assuming further, are laments that come from the maternal point of view toward their own son or through a country embodied in the imagination of a son or daughter. But what's interesting is that it is so focused in a particular way. In many languages, we don't have a name for a parent who's lost a child. And what we have here is not a word for a parent who's lost a child, but we have a song for it. And in this way, there is a way within which the lamentation of Mary, the mother of this boy, and you don't know, is she singing to a child or is she singing to the corpse of an adult son? That her grief is joined with the grief of others. And that's one of the gestures, I think, of the poetry of lament, is that usually it's so particular that it actually begins to appeal in a level that's further than the particular, as you'll see with the various ones that we're going to look at. The next one we're going to take a very brief look at, it's so simple and so short, is from the great American poet Langston Hughes. Many of you might be familiar with him from the Harlem Renaissance, extraordinary poet and man of the world, almost like an artistic diplomat on behalf of the United States. This is only titled Poem. It's in an early collection of his. I loved my friend. He went away from me. There's nothing more to say. The poem ends soft as it began. I loved my friend. It's heartbreaking, this beautiful, simple poem. There's almost no adornment or ornamentation into the language. Every syllable is simple, and so many of the words are of a single syllable nature. There is the curiosity. Who is FS, this character to whom it's dedicated? We don't know. It's thought that perhaps FS was a Jamaican seaman who was living in Harlem at the same time as Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes was private about his life, and so we don't know. It mightn't even be about this particular friend. Maybe this FS was a friend who was a comfort during this other time of grief. Was it a lover? Was it someone else? I don't know. And in a certain sense, one of the things I don't want to be is predatory upon the private life of Langston Hughes, to imagine that I need to comprehend his private grief in order to think about the wider appeal of the poem. So many of us live in the reality of strained relationships or broken relationships or ended relationships or things that you wish could be unsaid or things that you wish you could comprehend. And I think this poem is a great friend in the context of that. I loved my friend. He went away from me. There's nothing more to say. The poem ends soft as it began. I loved my friend. It's terrible that friend and ends rhyme in this poem. I hate that rhyme. It's a daring rhyme, I think, to put that in there and to remind us of the reality that many of us know, that human connections are frail and need tending, and that they are always liable to somehow, for whatever reason, comprehensible or incomprehensible, to be put under strain. This brave poem, this vulnerable personal poem, as well as this private poem, I think is a companion to us in private laments, or in laments about friendships that have been put under strain. I want to take a hop, skip, and a jump through the first chapter of the Book of Lamentations. Let me take off the screen just for a sec. The Book of Lamentations is in 5 chapters, and what's so interesting is that it is written absolutely within the context of poetry. 4 of the 5 chapters are in the form of acrostic poetry, in the sense that they go through the alphabet, with each successive verse beginning with a separate letter of the alphabet. The translation that I have for you here, Robert Alter, is not one that keeps that particular translation into English. I do love Robert Alter's translations, though, so that's why I put it here. I'm not going to read the full chapter, but what we see here is a different kind of lament. It's a public lament. It's a lament for the end of a city after the destruction of Jerusalem. Nobody knows who wrote this. It's attributed often, of course, to Jeremiah, because Jeremiah foretold some of what this lament is lamenting. But there's no kind of scholarly consensus really as to who did write it. What is interesting in all of these is the way within which, at a time of lamentation, people turn to form. We look to something that can be a container. There's a lovely old Breton prayer, Breton being another, it's a Celtic area of Europe in northwestern France, and there's a lovely Breton prayer from there that says, God help me, the sea is so big and my boat is so small. I love the desperation of that prayer and the beauty of it, and the imagery of it too. To my mind, it must come from somebody who's part of a fishing community. God help me, the sea is so big and my boat is so small. And one of the things that I think that prayer is aching for is a vessel that's good enough, that's adequate enough for the little you can do in the middle of difficulty, which is to try to find something that will help for now. And one of the things that helps for now in a time of difficulty is the form of lamentation. And we see this in the rhyming that Langston Hughes employs, in the very repetitive refrain that the first lament that we heard sung there by Iarla O'Linard did. Form has a function for us, which is in a certain sense to hold together what we find very difficult to hold together. It doesn't do it perfectly. Nothing does. The question is does it do it enough for now? And I suppose the return and return and return over millennia of the human animal to forms of poetry shows us that even if it doesn't do it perfectly, it certainly helps us and it keeps us coming back. So let's look a little bit at the first chapter of Lamentations. And again, I've seen a couple of people come in. I am taking utter delight at how tardy these Presbyterians are, because I have a stereotype that Presbyterians are all perfectly on time. And I'm blaming Clover 100% for all of this. And she will be delighted to refute my blame of her. So, but just so that those of you who came in a little late know, I am obviously putting this up on the screen. But Tim has some handouts that you can see afterwards as well, if you wish to read some of these a little deeper, because really what we're doing is taking a hop, skip, and a jump through a bunch of poems here. But let me put up this next one on the screen, which is from the first chapter of the book of Lamentations in the Hebrew Bible. How she sits alone, the city once great with people. She has become like a widow, great among nations, mistress among provinces, reduced to forced labour. She weeps on through the night, and her tears are on her cheek. She has no consoler from all her lovers. All her friends have betrayed her, have become enemies to her. Judah is exiled in affliction and in hard labour. She dwells among the nations, she finds no rest. All her pursuers overtake her in straits. The roads of Zion mourn without festival pilgrims. All her gates are desolate, her priests are groaning, her virgins are sorrow-stricken, and she, it is bitter for her. And then it goes on. And what's so interesting is some of the geographical details that this poet is employing to try to convey what's happening all around, her pursuers, the straits, the roads mourn without festival pilgrims. Everything is given a voice here. And what's happening in this lament is a fascinating piece of bravery within a certain form of poetry, which is to look at the desolation of a city, and rather than to engage in rage and fantasies of revenge towards an enemy, this is imagining that the city itself is complicit in its own downfall. And rather than thinking, well, we're going to build an army bigger and we're going to do to their city what has been done to us. And you do find sentiments of revenge towards Babylonians, for instance, in some of the Psalms. May your children's heads be dashed against the rocks. But there's the absence of this. You see it here. An offense did Jerusalem commit. Therefore she became despised. All who honored her degrade her, for they've seen her nakedness. She on her part groans and has fallen back. There is something very interesting in what it is that lament is being asked to convey here. Lament with strict form in 4 of the 5 chapters of this book is being asked to convey something like desolation, but it is also desolation that comes with the imagination of accountability, and something like pretty brutal self-recrimination too. The book of Lamentations has within it the understanding that shame might have something to teach us, which is a fascinating thing. These days, shame gets a lot of shame for being shame, and I don't like it when anybody is shamed in public. That doesn't interest me, and I think it's an act of violence. But certainly coming from Ireland, where I look at how Irish people who suffered during the 1800s under what Britain was doing to Ireland at that stage over the various 700 years of British presence in Ireland, Irish people who suffered went far afield to the United States, to Canada, Jamaica, Montserrat, New Zealand, Australia, and there did unto others what had been done unto them, and really became secondary participants in colonization. And what I look for is poetry that can hold us to account for ourselves, not just blame the Brits for what was done to us, but also blame ourselves for saying, yeah, but did we learn anything when we went overseas to other places? And there's something about the prescient moment of lamentation and shock and grief for taking stock and bearing witness. And I find that to be a very brave aspect that you see in the Book of Lamentations, that you also, that we have need for in many parts of the world today. I'll speak particularly about the Irish context in that way. I'm going to move on a little bit. Let me see, there's so many delicious poems we can look at. You can look at them in your own time. There's another element of lamentation that you see coming from a very, very famous poem from Robert Hayden, a sonnet, and I love this poem, even though it's profoundly sad. Those winter Sundays, you might know it from school. A lot of people that I have met from the States will say, oh, we did this in school. Those winter Sundays. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold, then with cracked hands that ached from labour in the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? It's extraordinary. Robert Hayden is such a concise poet. And I think the work that this 14-line poem does is, it goes backwards and forwards in time. It seems to me, I could be entirely wrong about this is a poem written by a man in midlife who's reflecting on what it was like when his father was the age that he is now. Robert Hayden was adopted by the next door neighbours. His mother stayed living next door. It was a difficult circumstance. The family into which he was adopted was brutal at times. Fearing the chronic angers of that house is not an exaggeration. And yet, at midlife, maybe as a parent of a teenager himself at that stage, although that's just a guess from me, He is looking back and thinking about the love that his father was showing, love's austere and lonely offices. This is a lament for what he didn't know at a young age and what now he has come to know, perhaps, which is that love comes in complicated ways. And while you might want a sufficient love when you're younger, that sometimes can mean that the love that is coming, limited as it might be, can be difficult to notice. I have such sadness for the speaker of this poem. I feel like he's being very, very hard on himself. But I find it very moving as well. I love the wisdom that comes with it and the wisdom that it draws all of us to. But I do hear the lamentation in the speaker for the fact that he didn't, and I would argue couldn't, recognize that love was present in that father who made the house warm 7 days a week, because there was so much difficulty that was present there too, and so much silence, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. Good shoes for Sunday service, I'm guessing. Driven out the cold of the house, but it seems like there was coldness between these characters of father and son, painful and difficult. And this too is an opportunity for lament and accountability, even though I think this is especially harsh by the speaker upon the speaker. I'm going to make sure not to talk too much, because I want to make sure to have a little time for a few questions. I'm going to mention a few of these, and this is a PDF that's been sent to Clover and Tim, and as well as a handout, so you can look at these. So I'm going to mention a few poems. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but I think you might find it helpful, especially given what we're facing this week in terms of anniversaries. This brilliant poem by Victoria Riddell from her book Paradise is in many ways a lament for what is lost and cannot be found, cannot be gotten back. Victoria Riddell is herself and her sister are the first women in her family line for generations upon generations where children were born in the same country as parents. Because of pogroms, anti-Semitic pogroms all the way throughout Europe and the Middle East, her family moved all kinds of places, generation after generation, such that no child was born in the same place as the mother for a long time, until Victoria and her sister in the United States. This poem really is a reflection on Exodus, not as biblical theme, but as theme of desperation for safety. We came from somewhere, had a village, then didn't. It fantasizes about finding a grandmother's trunk with memories. You see it here. In my grandmother's trunk, I found a boat. In my grandmother's trunk, I found a boat and a train. In my grandmother's trunk, I found a boat, a train, August wine, the river proved, an uncle in prison, a book of addresses, a box of faces. And then look at this, the next stanza. Identity papers were stamped. At some point, our name twisted to local consonants. Were stamped, our name twisted to. This is language that is not fixed to any particular actor. Who did this? They have anonymity, while the identities of Jews from all across Europe were being erased and annihilated. And this poem is a lament not just for what happened, but a lament for the irrecoverability of what was lost, if you have a chance to have a look at it. This is a recent poem. It was just written last November by Rifat al-Harir in Gaza. If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze and bid no one farewell, not even his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is here, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a tale. You see the poetics of this with the if I must die here, and then the repetition of the if I must die here, the extraordinary contraction really that you see between the profound lament and the rage at what is happening, and that image of the kite, and that image of a child. The terrible thing is that Rifat al-Harir wrote this poem. He was born in 1979, and he wrote this poem knowing that he was very likely to die. And indeed, he did die a few weeks after he wrote this poem. Himself, his wife, their 6 children, a couple of his siblings, their spouses, and all their children too, all in a family compound, 30 of them, killed by a bomb. within a couple of weeks of this, which is almost like a preemptive lament, a very pragmatic lament, and turning to the whimsy of a kite in order to say something profoundly political. And that's what I want to say too, is that lament has enormous space for the political. This is a slightly longer poem that I'm not going to say anything about, other than the fact that concerning that prayer I cannot make by Jane Mead, it seems to me to be a prayer that is lamenting death. That beautiful poem, this is my reading of it, but it seems to me to be written by somebody who's come out of some kind of rehabilitation, and the profound crisis facing her is not the crisis of death, but the crisis of what to do now that I've survived it, have found some vehicle for living, and what do I do now? How do I live? I don't know. And there is sadness for the fact that sadness has to leave, and what do I do now? The whole world seems open, a little bit frightened, and she goes to abandoned warehouse places by the side of a fairly murky river and looks at all of the things that are happening in the bright winter sunlight and tries to figure out, who can I be? How can I live now that I've made it through? And there's a lament for that too, the lament for how it is that difficulty and pain can take things from us, and we sometimes don't know how to live, and what we do know how to do is to destroy our lives and the lives of others. But when we are finally faced with the possibility of going, what might peace be like with myself, with my family, with my compulsions, with my community, with my politics, what do I do now? And what I think is so brave and brilliant about this poem of Jane Mead's, it's the first poem in her first book that she ever published, is that it takes that moment of trying to figure out, how do I live? And it is a lament for sadness as it's going, and it's some kind of prayer for the possibility of living. It's called Concerning That Prayer I Cannot Make, and I love it. It's absolutely beautiful. You'll see it on the PDF. And yeah, I think that's where I'll finish. I'll have an opportunity just for a few questions if Tim wants to gather a few and I can respond to them. But I hope that it's helpful for you to think a little bit about the many things that lamentation can do. It can be rage, it can be accusation, it can tell story, it can be accountability, it can be trying to shore yourself up, and it also can be simply the sounds that for which there are no words. So.
Thank you so much, Pádraig. Pádraig, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. And we have Todd with a mic back here, and I'm going to stay up here because he probably won't be able to hear you. Everyone else will be able to hear you, but I'll have to reconvey the comment or question to Pádraig so that we can hear his response. Questions, thoughts? Mary Jo.
Thank you so much. I would love to hear part of a poem that you've written that's a lamentation and what kind of prompted it, if you have one easily accessible.
Can you hear that, Pádraig? No?
No.
Okay. The request was that you might share something you've written that's related to, that's a lament or something along those lines.
Okay, well, let me have a think about that. I'll finish with that. Take another question, and I'll find one surreptitiously so that nobody will notice.
Good. Others?
Just a comment.
Yep.
Yes. I've learned to deal with this lament from the words of an Irishman, a Catholic priest in Camden, New Jersey, often one of the poorest and most violent cities in America. And Father Michael Doyle had shared with me when I felt overwhelmed by just the brokenness, the harshness that I saw young people growing up in. And he said, Jim, you do your bit. I do my bit. And bit by bit, we make a difference. And I've lived by that. And I think of all the hardship you've shared in those poems and how I've managed to live with this by doing my bit. Thank you.
So the comment and expression of thanks is recalling a memory, a close friendship with Father Michael Doyle in Camden, who works in a very impoverished community and can be very overwhelming. And what Father Doyle said was something like, and you've told me this before, and I'm hoping I get it right, you do your bit and I'll do my bit, and together we'll keep moving. And so I think an expression of trying to scale down to what we can do, while at the same time making space for the grief and lament that you have been talking about. Does that sound? I got it mostly right.
How has your Irish heritage shaped your appreciation for lamentation and the value you attach to lamentation?
So the question is, how has your own Irish heritage and background shaped your appreciation for lamentation and the poetry of lament?
Well, certainly there's two parts to that, at least, which is the Irish background shaping an appreciation for poetry, and then within that, poetry of lament. I'm very lucky. I grew up in an education system. I just went to the local village school, nothing fancy. But we were learning poems off by heart in two languages, Irish and English, from the age of 5 to 17, 2 poems every week. And so it meant that at the end of every year, you're supposed to know about 70 poems, half in one language, half in the other, off by heart. Of course, I've forgotten most of them, but when I turn back to those poems, it's in me to go, I knew this once, and there's lines that I can recall without even realizing that I could at one point have held them in my heart. And so, of course, then within the context of the colonization of Ireland, so many of the Irish language poems were poems of resistance, of lament, of complaint, of pain, of love for land that was also a lament for what was not there, which was freedom and sovereignty to move where you wished. And so I think to come from any place where your language has been taken away, people usually do turn to art and to music. And that is an education about what language can do, about what lamentation can do. And it is also, rightly so, a politicization of understanding that language is always political, and place and land is always political, and freedom and movement is always political also. And so, I feel like my Irish background is present in everything that I do when it comes to exploring this.
Thank you. You're reminding me of a day we spent with you in Patmos this last summer, where you'd gone away for a couple hours, and we met up with you at this funky little bar cafe right on the edge of the sea, and you had spent the hour and a half or so memorizing a little more of a Seamus Heaney poem, and then recited that to us. I wonder if you could say a little more about the value of that practice of memorization of poetry.
I mean, I think the English language is beautiful when it comes to this, to be able to recall a language by memorization. The phrase that lots of us use is to have a poem by heart or off by heart. And what a lovely thing it is to recognize that there's something about memorization that moves it, not just from recall, but somehow into the heart, the center of the psyche, the center of being, the center of encounter, the center of eternity in a certain sense. The Catholic Catechism reflects that the Jewish tradition highlights to us that the heart is the place of encounter with self and with God. And so it was a difficult day that I was having in Patmos, and I thought, well, why don't I put something into the heart? Because there's some sadness in the heart. Why don't I put something else in? And that Seamus Heaney poem, Postscript, for any of you who are wondering which one it is about taking a drive out along the flaggy shore. The lines in it that I keep on calling back to mind are, "You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass." What a gorgeous, gorgeous thing to have as an accompaniment for a day that I didn't know how to contain. And so what I did was to accompany it in the heart with some language. I don't do that often enough. I wish it sounds like it's a thing that I do all the time. It used to be. I'm trying to do it more now. But yeah, you are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass. Those lines have become part of me now, which is much more than just being able to quote Seamus Heaney. In a certain sense, those lines belong to me now because I've added to them by the way that they have sought an audience in my life.
Thank you.
Pádraig, I have been fan crushing on you for many years, and so I'm very nervous right now, and I can't believe I'm like speaking to you. Mostly I've known you through Poetry Unbound and following you on social media, but have had such deep affection and appreciation for the sort of gateway you are to something very holy and unique. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that to you, since you're sitting right here in front of me. It's crazy. Thank you for all that you bring into the world.
So, confession of a long-standing crush on you. And
Thank you very much.
well, we can connect you guys later. And expression of heartfelt gratitude for your work and your voice. And I think what I heard was how that is a gateway to the holy for her and for, I think, for many of us.
It's very kind. Thank you for saying that. Yeah.
Yes.
One of the awful things about Zoom is that you can see yourself blush, which is a terrible, terrible crime. I should have turned off that self-greeting. Awful. But thank you for the kindness.
Hello, Pádraig. My name is Diane, and I guess I just, thinking about this and listening to you and the poetry, I read a lot of Irish literature, and it seems that no matter whether it's a comedy like Paddy O'Doyle does or some of the other authors, there's always a thread of lament, always. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little to the Irish culture that lament undergirds, it seems. Do you agree with that, or is that, am I just making it up? So, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Diane. So this is from someone who has read a lot of Irish fiction and a lot of work from Irish novelists, and she was commenting that there too, as well as in the poetry, finding this sort of maybe even between the lines sometimes, but as a thread of lament running through narrative as well, and wondering if that resonates with you, and if you could maybe say more about how Irish culture might lend itself to that or make space for that.
Sure. I mean, partly it's Irish history requires it. I think if you go to any place, and any community, any nation, I don't mean that in terms of modern nation state necessarily, but I'm thinking of Lenape Nation here in the upper and the northeast part of the United States, just as one of the nations in this old continent of Turtle Island. Ireland as well, and so many places, mostly a technology for survival amongst those who were lucky enough to survive. And sometimes it was pluck and sometimes it was just luck, has been to put sorrow into words for lamentation. And so I don't think that there's anything particular to a language that lends it to being better at being able to convey lament. But there is something particular about experience, and experience of generation after generation after generation after generation of this, where the future is being stolen on a regular basis, that it requires an inevitability of the art of that community to turn itself towards multiple expressions of rage and lament and resistance and hope and all of the things that come with that. It's important, like it's really, really important to say that lamentation is an activity of the living. It's what the living do, because the dead don't lament as far as we know. We don't know. There's the great beyond, into which we project our hopes or imaginations or poetry. But to lament is an act of the living. And I think there can be this resistance to doing it because you feel perhaps like you're calling death upon you or calling sadness upon you. In fact, you're not. You're doing exactly what the living know to do, which is to give voice to the sound in us, the voice that is saying, here's what I wish I hadn't lived through, here's what I wish I didn't know, or what I wish I did know, here's who I miss, here's what life could be had life not been the way it has turned out to be. All of those things. Some of it might be an accusation, some of it might be a resentment, some of it might be simply accepting, well, this is the way things are, there's nothing anybody could have done. All of those things are forms of lament, whether in prose or poetry, and they are the concern of the living. And it is worthwhile finding in our communities, and I do think religious communities are poised well for this, finding a way within which lamentation can be heard and voiced without a quick rush to, but it'll all be okay, because we know we're all going to die. Please God, after a long and flourishing life, and please God with rich relationships. But death awaits us all. And there's something of intelligence in lamentation about how to live, and shutting lamentation down or trying to rush lamentation into laudation, that's an unfair thing to do. You see sometimes in the Hebrew Psalms, that somebody will be saying, this is happening, and this is happening, and this is happening, and this is happening, and it's terrible, and at my right hand these awful people, and at my left hand these awful people, but I will praise you, O God. As a poetry editor, I sometimes would love to go back to that psalmist and go, you can take the last bit out, because nobody believes you, not even God. And by saying what's going wrong, you're actually telling us your moral impulse, your pain, your sadness, the demonstration of your love, and that's enough. I appreciate that somebody wanted to turn it like that, and that was a particular convention. But I think it's very bad pastoral practice in a community of people. If somebody comes in and says, this lamentation has occurred in my life, and somebody else might say, yeah, but you've got 3 more people you love. Never mind, you've lost 2, but you've got 3 more. We know that doesn't work. That feels like an assault for somebody to be forced into joy, when actually what they're doing is telling us the experience of living, and when living has been heavy. So,
thank you. We're getting close to wrap-up time. Have we given you the ability in this other little compartment in your mind to find something to share?
Yeah, I have a little poem that I can share.
I'm impressed.
It's a very, very short one.
I'm going to remove us so that we can just see you while you share that.
Okay.
Let's see, hide self. There we go. All right, take it away.
This one is called The Pedagogy of Conflict. I wrote it when I was poet in residence for a convening where there was British and Irish people of all political persuasions, people who'd been members of the British Armed Services, people who'd been members of other combatant groups, people who were victims of terror, people who were perpetrators of terror, people who'd been victims of terrorizing police violence, etc. And in the room also there was a whole load of Israelis and Palestinians from all kinds of different political and personal and religious persuasions. And the aim of this conference was to see whether, if we spent 3 days with each other, we could argue well and try to express some wisdom. Important to say that this particular convening happened many years ago, and it wasn't happening at a time of escalated threat. Of course, there was constant worry about certain things going on, but it wasn't like things are now. So I don't want to make it out that convening such gatherings like this would be necessarily a way forward in the here and now. But one of the things that struck me in that gathering was how often so many of us there made reference to what it was like when you realized that what was normal for you, police brutality or guns in the house or paramilitary activity, etc., that those things weren't normal for other people in other parts of the world. In the room, one person said, "Oh, look, I never murdered anybody. I only ever shot at legitimate targets." And then somebody else in the room said, "Well, I suppose that must have made me a legitimate target when your organization shot at me when I was 8 years old." And so this very short part of a poem came. It's the third part of a poem called The Pedagogy of Conflict. When I was a child, I learned to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But these days, I've been counting lives. So I count one life, one life, one life, one life, one life, because each time is the first time that that life has been taken. Legitimate target has 16 letters and one long, abominable space between two dehumanizing words. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you. Thank you to Clover for the invitation, and everybody for taking your time.
I'm sorry that you couldn't hear the collective gasp in the silence after that, but thank you so much for sharing that beautiful poem. And we just want to thank you again, Pádraig, for being with us. This has been such a gift.
My pleasure.
And just thank you, thank you, thank you.
My pleasure. Good to be with you all. Thanks for the opportunity.
Talk to you again soon. All right, thank you all. That worked pretty good. And that's on, there's some copies up here. We can make more. And Pádraig did give us a PDF with these, so we can share them. You probably know, or if you don't, you should know that this is recorded, so you can also go and look at those poems on the YouTube site as well for it. So thank you all for coming. Thanks for being part of this series. Thanks to the Adult Education Committee for organizing it and convening it. I think it's been a really great way to begin the fall. Thank you all.